My name is Akira Nakahara. I'm a CEO of Imperative21, which is a network of networks trying to weave together narrative power, shared narrative power, to help movements and organizations sustain and accelerate a new economy. Super excited for my panelists here for this conversation. They're all incredible experts in their area around talking about systems and stories. Today's topic is about how we transform those stories that keep up broken systems. And part of that is inherently negative, right? We have broken systems that we're going to be talking about, and we are talking about how do we break through with new narratives that help us have systems that are designed by and for all of us. I'm gonna balance that inherent negativity with a lot of excitement of what is happening now on building new narratives. The possibilities are here, that you're gonna hear about some tangible things that are happening that I'm really excited to learn more about as well. As we go through this, a few things that I just want to say that we're going to try to cover off here. We're going to try to talk about the reinforcing power between systems and stories, and how they share, they strengthen each other. And so if we want to do the systems work, we have to do the storytelling work, and vice versa. We're also going to be looking at what's it going to take to break through. What are the gaps that we're missing, or what are the things that need to take place so that we can shift the culture, shift the terrain, so that the projects that we're doing, the policy changes are long-lasting. And I want to make sure that you're going to hear some examples of the work that they're doing here, and also other things that that are in the air that I think are really, really exciting that we can get involved in right away. We're going to have, as Mark mentioned, a bit of a Q&A at the end, because I'm sure there's lots of interesting questions that you all have. So I think that card business has happened. I'm not too sure how that works, but we'll be taking some questions at the end. So with that said, that's the mission for today. I want to introduce the panel to you, because they are experts of themselves as well. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and save myself the trouble. If you guys could just a little bit about who you are, what brought you to this kind of work, and we'll just go down the line real quick.
Cool. Hey, everyone. My name's Trevor. My pronouns are he, him. I am the co-founder of the BLIS Collective. BLIS stands for Black Liberation, Indigenous Sovereignty. Co-founded it with my co-founder, Savannah Romero. Her pronouns are she, her. She's Eastern Shoshone. And yeah, I mean, we both came into this work from movement building, system building, a bit of philanthropy. I used to work at the Cerner Foundation. Right after that, I worked at Liberation Ventures. And I'll talk a little bit more about this once we get into it, but BLIS was birthed out of one conversation that me and Savannah had the first time that we met, asking ourselves, why are Black-led movements and Indigenous-led movements so siloed? And what, if anything, could we do to address it? So we met at a grad school party. We came up with the name BLIS at the party, and now we're here 3 years later, with a mission and an org and staff, and some really exciting stuff that I'm excited to tell you all about today.
Very cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen McGirt, she, her. I am currently the editor-in-chief of Design Observer, which is a small independent media company that we like to think is focused on the people and the initiatives and the ideas that just hold a piece of a better world, and for that means more equitable. But I came to that as a good old-fashioned business journalist struggling to find a story, make a story, have an impact. And I focused in the last 10 years, 7,000 years it feels like, on leadership, equitable leadership, inclusive leadership, and very specifically through the lens of race and corporate systems and the systems they touch, which is the story I'll tell when we get kicked off here. But so it's just wonderful to be back. I haven't been at SOCAP since before the pandemic, which seems like a lifetime ago. So I'm not here necessarily as a subject matter expert, but I know a good story when I see one, and I know that SOCAP is filled with good stories. So thank you in advance for all the work that you do too.
Hello. Okay. Hi, I'm Laura Callanan. I'm the founding partner of Upstart Collab. At Upstart, we believe that creative people solve problems, and we're connecting capital with creative people who make a profit and make a difference. I launched Upstart in 2016, and immediately before that, I was the senior deputy chair at the National Endowment for the Arts, so the #2 person leading your federal arts agency. And this was in the second Obama administration, and at that time, the budget was $150 million. So Americans are very generous, and philanthropy brings $20 billion a year to arts and culture in the US, which is great. But back in 2014, 2015, socially responsible capital was about $8 trillion in the United States. And so I started Upstart to figure out how to get a little tiny piece of that large multi-trillion-dollar number to start to pay attention to art and design and culture and heritage and creativity.
Thank you all. Very excited for this conversation. I wanted to start off by doing a quick level set. I'm sure many folks in this room have been thinking about narrative for a while, but it's meant even I, who work in narrative, sometimes need the explanation of which kind of narrative are we talking about here. So one way of thinking about it for this particular conversation is we're really thinking about, when we're talking about how we transform the stories that maintain broken systems, we're thinking about the terrain, the environment in which stories either blossom and move culture or hold the current culture, the current system back. And I'm sure many of you have experienced in your work, there are things within the culture or within norms that we have currently that are holding back the progress that we'd like to see made. So I don't remember, I don't want to forget to give credit, but I don't remember who came up with this, but it's something that has stuck with me, which is thinking about narrative as kind of like the water that spreads irrigates a soil system in which systems currently exist. And where the water flows to, things blossom. Where it doesn't flow to, it doesn't. And so when we're thinking about the narrative terrain and where we're going to be talking about narrative infrastructure and connection between systems and stories, we have to wonder and ask, where does water need to flow? And understand that sometimes if we're not aware of the environment that we're in, we won't be able to plant seeds that will actually grow. So the sunlight, everything else, I'm probably gonna mess up this metaphor at some point, but that's just one way of thinking about how we're doing that. So it kind of leads me to my first question, Trevor. You've been a researcher, a writer, strategist, just many things. You are also a narrative change strategist. You're focused on the subjects of wealth inequality, racial inequality, reparations. From your experience and from your perspective, how do you see stories maintaining broken systems?
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce another metaphor for this question. I wrote down a metaphor for myself, and then I'll answer the question. So I wrote down that narratives and systems are deeply intertwined, and the way that I generally describe it, I take from our colleagues Harmony Labs, they're like a behavioral science research firm. They say narratives are the averages of our most popular stories. And so that's how I generally describe it. And I also say like narrative change and systems change are cousins to each other. And what I wrote down are that narratives are like the operating codes for systems, the underlying scripts that tell us how things should work, who deserves what, and what's possible. Systems, whether economic, social, or political, are built upon these stories, upon these narratives. And narratives give systems their legitimacy. And guide how they function, while systems in turn reinforce and spread these narratives to ensure their stability. So that's how I kind of think about it, or that's what I wrote down, at least for today. And I think a key part of narrative change work is, narrative power. In the same way that we have economic power, political power, social power, which I think is very deeply connected to narrative power. What are the stories that we tell ourselves as a nation? I think narrative change work is deeply intertwined to national identity, who we are as a nation, and the stories that we tell ourselves as a nation. And so I think all of this work that we're trying to do is uprooting, or at least that I'm trying to do, is uprooting the status quo stories that we tell ourselves as a nation. And in the same way that this country has quote unquote founding fathers, I think this country has quote unquote founding narratives. And the two biggest of which that I am focused on are that, this land was land that was found, which is a falsehood. And that the indigenous people on this land and that the African people that were brought to this land were quote unquote savages. Indigenous folks framed as savages so that a genocide could be committed upon them. And then African folks framed as savages so that we could build the institution of slavery and empower what has now become the richest country in this nation. And so while the institution of slavery does not exist anymore, and while the genocide, I think, arguably is still ongoing, but the land theft of indigenous people is complete, the narratives that were cemented in the quote-unquote founding of this country still exist today. And so the work that I try to do, the work that BLIS tries to do, is get folks to think about, well, what does it mean to have this quote unquote democracy on stolen land and much of this wealth built on stolen labor, and how do we grapple with that? How do we address these founding stories and rewrite new stories so that we can come out on the other side an actual democracy, and live up to the stated ideals of this nation? And so that's the work we're trying to do, really rewrite what it means to be a quote unquote American.
Yeah, I love the connection between identity, like national identity, and as well as the story of power, and the reinforcing of how that shows up in the system, and the fact that the system is there reinforces the story that's being told. And I think that in that segue, Ellen, I'm just gonna lean in to see you there. As a business journalist, speaking of power, you profiled some of the most successful companies, successful people, financially successful people for many years. Where in the intersection of your work did the connection between narratives and systems begin to influence your work, and what's your perspective having been through that to what's maybe at stake or what's needed?
I appreciate the question, and I've been thinking a lot about it, so I do have to tell you kind of an appalling story that, I'm not going to lie, I do enjoy telling people, which is how I really came to wrestle with the fact that we were telling the same broken story, broken narrative over and over and over again when we profiled powerful people. It was November 2015, and I got a direct message on then Twitter from the then editor-in-chief of Fortune, a place I hadn't worked in about 7 years. I got mad, which you're going to hear why, and I went and worked for a competitor. And he asked me in the DMs, "Hey, Alan, how you been? Any chance you want to write a story about why there's so few black men in the executive ranks in the Fortune 500? So I thank you. That's exactly what I said. It's like I'm sitting there in my slippers, like something's going on at Fortune. 2 things I knew from this request. One is he did not know a single person on staff or in his Rolodex, at least until he got to M, who felt comfortable even having the conversation with him about having this story. And the second one was that given our production schedule, I was going to have to work all through the holidays because this story was going to go for what issue? February, right? African American History Month. That's it. That's the only time we ever talked about black people, really. And so then I had to sort of do some thinking myself. So I had some reasons to be intrigued because it was an unusual request. It was framed in an unusual way. Cliff was continues to be an unusual person, even though he's not the editor-in-chief anymore. And I trusted him enough to have the conversation. But I had a lot of reasons to be really skeptical. Time Inc., which has since died, but owned Fortune at the time and a bunch of other magazines, had done an historically poor job dealing with race. We know some very high-profile examples, except for Essence, who was the one representative of race in the building, really. For years, I worked at Money Magazine, our sister publication, the world's most boring but necessary personal finance magazine. It's sort of hard to screw that up, right? Real people, real stories. Can this portfolio be saved? Can I help you, a real person with real lives, pick your Medicare supplement or your real estate portfolio? But I was pitching real people stories like a champ, super diverse, like all of the things that you would want from someone who wanted to represent the entirety of people who need personal finance advice, until someone after a number of years finally pulled me aside and told me explicitly the unspoken but absolutely ironclad rule that black people were not allowed on the cover of Money Magazine. Thank you. See why I love to tell this story? And so it's like, what? What do you mean? He said, well, if they're part of a group, like these people all got a better deal on their auto insurance and they're like jumping up and down like, yay us, that's fine. But if it's like you and me got a better, and like with our kid, no. So I processed that for a minute, and it turns out, and I did actually talk to a person in the marketing department who did the research, said to my face, this sweet young man said to me, look, we've done the math, we have the research, people don't think black people are good with money, it's on the newsstand, we can't afford it. I mean, I get that America's a racist country, what do you want me to do? So thinking about that, and I wish that there was a picture of me aging in an attic somewhere. This was not 1957, this was 2006. I'd worked there for long enough to have a real reputation and a stake in what we were doing. I was really proud of the work that I was doing. But you think about, of all the ways that this is horrible, and this is horrible, like on so many ways. One is all the good people I worked with, who knew, like I was the last to know, who needed their health insurance and needed their job and had an elder care issue and a kids issue, and it's like they don't really know what to say or do. We know much more about how to push back on stuff like this. I didn't know what to do at the time, really, and they just sort of live with this shit, and then. Sorry, they just live with this shit. And then, wrong emphasis. And then I think about what was happening across the aisle at Fortune, which published list after list after list of really powerful people, most powerful women in business, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, maybe 6, maybe 7, maybe black CEOs, maybe 0 that year. Well, I guess you're just not going to throw a P&L to a company, to somebody if we don't think people are good with money. So just like the whole, that was the whole way that trickled down just really sat with me as I'm staring at this DM from Cliff, who I love and trust. And I said, okay, let's talk about it. Here's what I think we need to do. And I'm not really sure where I got this big talk plan, but I had one. I said, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to do a typical Fortune story where we identify like the 1 or 2 outliers who just, don't need sleep and have the right partner and just manage to like corporate grit it out. And now I'm here at the top. What we're going to do is we're going to examine the C-suite pipeline from birth to C-suite, and we're going to examine where we're losing promising boys and men, starting with their mothers, starting with the environment that they're growing up in, starting with education, bias in education, and then criminal justice. We're going to interview a whole lot of people, some in corporate life, some not in corporate life. I actually got Chuck D on the phone for this, which was amazing. He's here. He's got in a competing session, so I would love to be able to thank him for finally coming to believe that I wasn't trying to sell him a subscription to Fortune. I really wanted his opinion, and Cliff agreed. We are going to look at the actual lived experience of this demographic that we say that we care about, and are now acting surprised that there's not like a whole bunch of them in corporate life. And we did. And I'll tell you, there's a million ways. If you have any follow-up questions, I can talk more about it. What happened very quickly? Most of everybody talked to me over the holidays. First, everyone took a break from their holidays to tell me their story. They told me their truth. It was rough. It was some of the most raw, candid reporting I've ever done, and everybody trusted me. They heard the moment too. I'm a stranger to most of these people, including the executives, and they trusted me to navigate this material in mostly its correct form through the machine and out into the world, and we did it, and I got there. The story won an award, which is important for Fortune, more for them than for me, but it started a conversation. There were so many men's stories in there that suddenly people in our ecosystem wanted to talk about this, and they wanted to talk about justice. A big consultancy wrote a big, wonderful check and asked if we would be willing to expand our coverage of race, equity, and justice in this kind of granular way. That's how I got a column. That's how I got a regular newsletter. I had my own little profit center inside a media company, which is very rare. And because of that DM, and because we managed to get all that magic together, and I was just mad enough to see if this was going to work, Fortune went from talking about truly black issues once a year to every business day. I'm gonna end it there. There's a lot more work to do. I know we're all feeling nervous about the backlash and nervous about the world. I have to believe that the seeds that I was lucky enough to be able to document and observe are continuing to grow lots of places, even if I can't see them and even if we can't feel them.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's so inspiring to hear this story and just how what a difference it made to get that story done, and then all the stuff that came after that, and the coverage what that meant to the people that you were talking to. It's also incredibly infuriating. This was the starting point,
I was like a cobra laying in wait. I just happened to have like the right amount of caffeine in my system. It's like, yeah, you want to talk about race?
Yeah.
At Fortune, I can help you. But sometimes you get lucky, and I really just got lucky.
Yeah, I mean, and what a difference from covering it once a year to
every day.
To every day. And that's the difference of where investing in storytelling and what the difference it can make in people's perspective is so massive. And I think, Ellen, you definitely know the story. Many people here probably know the story as well of the fish in swimming in water, right? When we're talking about narrative norms. And, the old fish says to two young fish, goes, "Hey, how's the water?" And the two fish just kind of swim by, don't say anything at first, and then eventually one says to the other, "What's water?" And that's kind of what you were talking about before, that these are the stories. It was, what do you mean? We just don't cover that. We don't put that on the cover. That's what do you want me to do about it? Fish don't know that they're in water. They don't know anything else. So what we're trying to do when we're shifting culture and norms is actually making people... See, I knew I was going to mess up the two water metaphors. That's confusing. I think you get what I mean. The point is, shifting culture is so powerful to actually shifting systems as well. And Laura, I want to talk to you about this. You're the founding partner of Upstart Collab, which I'm very excited to learn more about, to help bridge impact investing and the creative economy, which I also want to learn more about what the creative economy is. Can you tell me about this work, what drove it, and the important role storytelling and the case making has played in doing the work?
So I didn't realize when I started Upstart and we said, we're going to connect impact investing to the creative economy, that I would spend all of my time defining impact investing to people in the creative economy and explaining the creative economy to everybody in impact investing. So I've had to learn to become a storyteller, and I hope I'm decent enough at it because the mission of my organization depends on it. Art organizations, museums, libraries, parks, zoos, performing arts centers in the United States hold about $64 billion in their endowments. Only 13% of them are doing anything with that money that's aligned with socially responsible and impact investing. I had a conversation with the leadership of this organization, the museum that we're sitting in today, about 7-8 years ago. They have a value statement. They have a very progressive, socially oriented mission at this institution. They had no interest in integrating their values into their investment policy statement. And so we've had to figure out the different ways to create that compelling story and that narrative to help the art historians who are the museum directors and their C-suite, who have a range of different skills and backgrounds, to feel brave enough to have a conversation with their trustees who sit on the investment committee, who are all the certified professional investors, right, who are supposed to be the folks who know about this stuff. And so some people get persuaded with data and evidence. So my team, working with the Black Trustees Alliance of Art Museums and the Association of Art Museum Directors, fielded the first ever survey of independent museums of art and design, because they hold 2/3 of that $64 billion. And we asked them where they were in their journey, and we were able to hold up the examples of the ones who were leading their peers. But 13% of art museums are thinking about diverse manager strategy and impact investing, compared to 49% of universities and 51% of foundations. So there's a gap to fill there, right? And so some cases you need the peer competition, like, well, the museum down the street's doing this, and in some cases you need the stark data about you don't give up financial performance, and yes, you can do it in all your asset classes, and so on, right? I've had conversations with arts program officers at foundations who've said to me, why would we want to have anything to do with business and investment? That's where all the problems have come in our communities. And on the one hand, I understand what they're saying. On the other hand, if you think this investment and business force is so powerful that it has been so harmful, why would you not want to harness this same power to do good? Since now we have examples for the last 25 years of how this is possible. So it's really hard having these conversations in the creative community, because people don't always feel comfortable or knowledgeable or confident about this information. And my baseline explanation to folks in the creative space about why they should care about impact investing is because, in the words of the great American bank robber Willie Sutton, that is where the money is. $8 trillion that says it shares your values. Why would you not want to go and have a conversation about how to bring that money to the work that you're doing? When I launched Upstart, gender lens investing had just really come into its own in a very, very short, spectacularly short period of time. It went from Jackie Vandenbrug giving a talk at SOCAP to suddenly it's in every strategy and every wealth advisor is offering it, and right. And so I went to the mothers of gender lens investing and I said, how did you do this? I need to follow your recipe because I need to bring forward the creative economy in a similar way. And they said it's a three-part strategy. Make the case, so the storytelling starts, it's the most important thing. Make the case, build the coalition of people who believe and want to share your values and want to see this happen, and then bring investable products to market and mobilize capital. But it starts with the case making. And I learned how important that conversation was in framing the argument in the early conversations I had with wonderful peers in the impact investing community who asked me, who heard impact investing in the creative economy, and they said, how is investing in a Picasso painting an impact investment? Okay. And I said, I don't think it is. How do I invest in a ballerina? I don't think you can, but that's not what we were talking about. And so the first thing we had to do, going back to your question, what is the creative economy, is define it in terms and using vocabulary and taxonomy and concepts that impact investors are comfortable with. I was at dinner recently with a friend who's a senior person at UNESCO, and we were talking about the creative economy with Jed Emerson, actually. And he's, we're talking about the definition, and my UNESCO friend said, well, there are so many definitions about the creative economy. And I was like, Jyoti, we don't have time for that. This is not a policy conversation. We need to get the money to move, right? So we looked at how states and regions around the US define their local creative economy, which they do when they plan for the future of their economy and the future for jobs in their region. And we used the NAICS taxonomy, right? So we used a taxonomy that business leaders and investors are familiar with. We took all the industries that were represented in any of the state and regional creative economy definitions, and we rolled them up to come up with a national definition, 145 industries. We learned along the way that the definition of creative economy represents the culture and heritage of your place. Louisiana includes food in its definition of creative economy, but not all the states do. So we started there. And then the second thing we did was to demonstrate that impact investors were already investing in the creative economy. I don't know if you're familiar with the Molière quote from one of his plays. One of his characters said, I did not realize I was speaking prose. We wanted to show impact investors that even if they hadn't named and framed their investment around creative economy and creative industries, terms that are familiar around the world but not used in the US, that they had been doing it. So we looked at more than 100 sustainable and impact funds that were already making investments in the creative industries. We found that about 20% of them were. That was, we weren't sure what we were going to find, but we did find that 20% of these impact funds were already investing in creative industries. And what we learned from that review of these existing funds was that those funds that were doing the most investing in the creative industries were led by BIPOC and women fund managers, and they were targeting investment in BIPOC and women entrepreneurs. So for us, that gave us a hint that people who are scrappy and often overlooked and underestimated have to be very, very creative in the work that they do. And naturally that leads them to work in fashion, film and TV, video games, food, the beauty industry, and all of these other creative industries. So I'm gonna stop there.
That's wonderful. I have a quick follow-up. As bridging between impact investors and the creative economy, for those who are in the creative economy, what has attracted the investment? How do they make the case for the return?
Well, then I will say the last thing that I had written down on this pad that I didn't want to go too long. The most important part of the story that Upstart's learned to tell has been around the impact that investors can achieve by investing in the creative industries. So much so that in the inclusive creative economy strategy that we launched earlier this year, while most of our investors love the arts, they're the Ford Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation, the Skoll Foundation, we have two foundations who've invested with us who have nothing to do with arts and culture and only share our impact thesis. So we wanted to demonstrate to impact investors that the impact was not beauty and deliciousness and wonderment and aesthetics. It was financial inclusion, quality jobs, and community development. And those are the first three elements of our impact thesis. We also think about sustainable lives and livelihoods for creative people, and we have the notion of what we call an inclusive creative economy that lifts up respect for traditional wisdom alongside innovation, and I think could, in the future, lead the way for a larger inclusive economy conversation. But we wanted to demonstrate to investors in the same way that we wanted to show we're talking about industries, not dance and opera and puppetry, right? We're talking about businesses and industries that are investable. We wanted to show that you don't need to throw your impact thesis and your metrics out the window. You can find that same impact that you're driving towards by investing in the creative businesses.
And as we're back to you, Trevor, as we're speaking a little bit about the impact thesis, I wonder if you could share a little bit of how you've defined that for BLIS and how it's the journey of BLIS to now has been tremendous. So I'd love if you could share a little bit of how you got to here and the ways you've defined impact to folks.
Yeah. So we call ourselves a solidarity and action hub that braids narratives and grows movements. So that's exactly and essentially what we do. Our mission is to spark radical collaboration and narrative alignment between and within Black, Indigenous, and transformative social movements to repair, decolonize, and reshape culture. Originally, when me and Savannah sat down to think about BLIS, we conceived or wanted to build what we call narrative infrastructure. And so our mission originally was building narrative infrastructure across these movements. Then I was at Sundance earlier, a very similar panel, earlier this year, talking to a storyteller, a filmmaker, and I was telling them about our mission, and they're like, what's narrative infrastructure? And so I went back, me and Savannah went back, we sat down and we thought about what do we mean by narrative infrastructure? What do we want it to do? And we think in the same ways that kind of public infrastructure, public parks, bridges, the US doesn't have that many of them, but public gyms, places where folks can come together, basketball courts. In the same way that they foster collaboration, they bring folks who may or may not have ever come into contact with each other, in contact with each other, they foster economic development. We thought of infrastructure in the same way as it relates to social movements and cultural ecosystems. And so when we broke it down, what we really thought, what we really are trying to do is create the space for different movements who have historically been pitted against each other because of the history of racial capitalism, because of colonialism, to be in what we call radical collaboration with each other. And I think what we often see across society as it relates to solidarity is what Savannah and I have kind of called puddle deep solidarity, very surface level. And what we really want to try to get to is ocean deep solidarity. And so our work falls into 5 buckets. We do research, narrative research, coalition building, both nationally and locally, cultural production. So we support local organizing with kind of cultural artifacts, cultural fellows, and then capacity building for funders, artists, and storytellers who are interested in narrative and culture change. And that's our outside power building strategy. Our inside power building strategy, we are building a collective of artists, organizers, and researchers. And so we took Rinku Sen from Narrative Initiative and Mick Moore, who's co-founder of the Yes and Laughter Lab. They came out with this framework a couple years ago for foundations on how they can invest in narrative change. And they talked about there's 3 key pillars: mass movements, mass media, and mass culture. And so we took that framework and we applied it to our inside power building strategy. So we'll be recruiting artists, organizers, and researchers, about 35 of them, who are situated within what we think are some of the most transformative social movements to address the inequality that we see today because of the rise of racial capitalism, the history and the rise of racial capitalism. And so those folks will come from the movements of reparations, and California was the first state to have a statewide reparations commission. The land back movement, so the movement to return land to indigenous communities and tribal nations. Guaranteed income, California, another state that's exploring it, so providing income to folks who are set, who make a certain amount, and then baby bonds, providing all children to families below a certain amount of wealth with a savings account that would be vested into. And these folks, one of the biggest benefits of our collective members will be access to this fund that we're that we've raised half of, called the Radical Collaboration Fund. And so over 3 years, we'll deploy $2 million to our collective members to what we say is scaling solidarity. And so we really want to see stories, content, coalitions, cultural production across these 4 movements that we see have very similar goals, but that are operating in silos and then are also pushing very kind of different narratives. Reparations, the narrative is more about closing the black-white wealth gap. Land back is really about like reorienting our relationship to land and to each other. And so I think that, and guaranteed income and baby bonds, they have their own narratives that they're pushing. And so we really want to create the space for folks to really grapple with how do we align toward a North Star. Even though we all are kind of addressing similar problems, we feel like, and we are uplifting solutions, the narratives that we're uplifting aren't very much aligned, and then our movements aren't very much aligned. And so this fund seeks to address that. It seeks to, we see ourselves as stewards of the fund, and so we're stewarding this fund for collective members to really decide what does it look like to scale a solidarity narrative across the nation, and create the space for folks to want to join these movements.
It's fascinating to hear from both of you just now just how much work there is to do, or how much assumptions there are that these narratives would share a lot more together, or that these things people would see themselves in the story. As we're talking about storytelling, it's about people seeing themselves in the story. And I love the ocean deep, another water metaphor, perfect for me. Obviously, I'm a fan. The contrast of what we're aiming for here versus puddle to ocean deep is really, really beautiful. The other thing that you mentioned before was the public places. And this might be a nice one for you, Alan, in thinking about the environment, what I was talking about before, the terrain for new stories to take place. Part of it is in some of our public places of conversation.
Right.
Are incredibly polarized, especially around system stuff like
Yep.
capitalism.
Yeah.
I think you know where I'm going with this because
Yeah.
you have this beautiful podcast called Capitalism that has just come out.
Thank you.
Would love to hear a little bit about why you did this work, what the hope of that work is to do to bring us into the importance of bringing us into conversation, especially when we don't agree, but we have to do things together, and to be able to see each other in community. So if you could speak a little bit about the podcast, and I know that you've just piloted a cohort of folks to be in community around that content.
It's been really an interesting experience. Before I talk about that, I just want to acknowledge my panel mates here. I'm really getting a lot of ideas and insights just from listening to you talk about this work. And to occur to your point, how much work it is to bring people together and to really think about what are we doing here to align. You're bringing information, but you're bringing patience. It's just sort of an extraordinary thing to imagine as you're talking about it. And then I think about my core audience, which I'm trying to re-engage with the podcast about capitalism, this sort of the long, interesting, hard truth about capitalism, is how quickly, as the division around race and the Supreme Court, all the things that we saw happen there, took what felt like a nascent movement organized loosely around a column and a newsletter platform, nothing nearly as thoughtful as hard work as what you're doing, all just became dissipated. And how terrifying it felt, and how I spend a lot of time talking to people and going to a lot of panels and conferences, sort of a permanent whistle-stop tour on how people are doing in transforming the workplace for equity. And how some people, if they were in an environment where things were going relatively well and they were surrounded by people who'd become more fluent in this language of equity and sharing power, they were continuing maybe more quietly to do the work, or if they were alone, they were really alone and having been unable to sell the vision inside to people who were more vulnerable than them. So I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and to move into your question, I spend a lot of time admiring people who are taking this work seriously. So I was very lucky. I got another call out of the blue from a person I admire very much named John Bewin, who runs a wonderful documentary outfit called Scene on Radio out of the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke. And he's known for he's got several seasons, now we've got 7 seasons of these extraordinary audio documentaries that take on big issues like patriarchy and race. Seeing White is one of my favorites, which is how I first heard of him. And he asked me if I would collaborate with him on a 10, 11, now 12-part series that we can't quit this podcast on capitalism, which is also how I met you, Akara, because this is something that you were able to bring some expertise to bear too. And it has been an extraordinary thing to take a minute, to stop not having to respond to breaking news and actually think about how things work and how things have developed into what they are and what racial capitalism means and what extractive capitalism actually means and what it means that now we have a billionaire class, what it means that nobody understands how financial markets work, and what are some of the opportunities and transition points to have a different conversation. 2008, the biggest market failure in history. I mean, it just didn't work. It is the opposite use case for capitalism and markets being rational and solving everything. Opened up slowly a series of conversations and opened up some new minds for people, for all of us to think through, what does it mean to have an equitable economy? What does it mean to have a relationship with land that makes sense? What does it mean to have actual worker protections? What does a social safety net look like? What could a society be better? We're all coming at it from different angles. But this is, I do not have an NPR voice, as you can probably tell. I really had to work at it. I'm very proud of my co-hosting ability, but this has been also a surprisingly emotional project. We spent a lot of time on the scripts. John did most of the research. He went back to pre-feudal England, which is hard to get worked up about, but to present day, which is very easy to get worked up about, right? And what does it mean to tell the story of capitalism by making sure that we are quantifying and explaining what genocide and a truly extractive economy. And one of our chapters was the repatriation movement. Like we were covering things that I would never have imagined a serious conversation about capitalism would have accommodated before, including the repatriation of land in Berkeley to the Ohlone people, which was just wonderful. And it is part of this continuum. And I'll end with the idea, which is where I started with the newsletter and the column about race called Race Ahead, is that through this work and through this reporting, I have gotten senses of places and bright lights of people and ideas, sometimes working together, sometimes working alone, but through their own perspective, a very clear vision of where the world could be better, where it could be more collaborative, where it could be more just, where we could have better conversations about all the health and equity and land and education, all those kinds of things. And it is not organized. It doesn't necessarily have a shape around it. But the idea that these concepts and this work is increasingly things that people are interested in, especially when things are really off the charts right now. It's terrifying and strange, has given me a tremendous amount of hope, which doesn't come naturally to most journalists.
The podcast is absolutely amazing for those who haven't checked it out yet. And what's exactly what you're saying. What's beautiful about it, and as we're talking about shifting narratives, is that this podcast helps you undertake your own journey, even as a maker of the podcast. And part of what we talk about when we start talking about shifting narratives, we don't often talk enough about having the conversation. And opening up the conversation so that we can explore in community and on our own that journey of identifying new possibilities, but and sometimes by springboarding to the past. It's called Capitalism. It's from Scene on Radio series. So if you look up Scene on Radio, the podcast is called Capitalism Season 7, wherever you get your podcasts. I don't want to hog the questions. There's some doozies here, so we're gonna try to go through a few of these, and whoever feels the bravest in taking this. This first one is one that I think is on a lot of people's minds often, is how do you measure narrative change, shifting culture beliefs, and this person was quite gentle and says, I know it's challenging, so thank you for that. It is very challenging. Who wants to jump on that one?
So I'll jump in. I mean, I think there's a number of things that you can look at. The way that I think about it, or the one of the main things that I think about it as an advocate is policy change and people's belief around policy change and some of the different viewpoints and behaviors as it relates to big transformative policy. And so when I graduated college in 2015, the case for reparations had just came out. And around my first job, one of my first jobs was at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and I was working with a researcher at Duke, Dr. Sandy Darity, who's one of the most prominent economists on this topic. And I was telling my mom, I was like, I think I want to figure out a way to work on reparations full time. And she was like, yeah, good luck with that. And, fast forward 10 years, from when Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote the case for reparations, we have now seen 3 states, California, Illinois, and New York, pass reparations commissions at the state level, and a number of cities across the country pass reparations commissions. And so people's support of transformative policies, particularly a topic like reparations, which to me isn't just an economic solution, it is also a policy solution that is forwarding pro-Black narratives. And as I talked a little bit about, this country is founded on anti-Black narratives. And one stat that I always think about came from Raj Chetty, I think it's 2018. He found that in 99% of neighborhoods, Black boys across comparable incomes always earn less than white boys who eventually became men in their neighborhood. So whether you are a low income, whether you are a Black boy that grew up in a low income neighborhood or a Black boy that grew up in a high income neighborhood, you always earn less in adulthood than the white boy who grew up next to you. That is not, to me, an issue of meritocracy. There's something deeper at play there. And to me, particularly for Black boys who eventually become Black men, and to me, it is anti-Blackness. And so when you forward a policy like reparations, which I think is carrying forth pro-Black narratives, you can measure people's sentiment over time as it relates to support for the issue, but then also support for Black people. And then just the last thing that I'll say as it relates to narrative or to measurement, on the topic of reparations, there's something that we call the hope gap. So support for reparations within the Black community is in the high 70, low 80 percentile. Belief that it'll happen in this lifetime is less than 10%. So we call that gap between support and belief the hope gap. To me, one of the things that I'm really focused on is shrinking that hope gap, particularly within Black communities, so that if Black folks believe that reparations are possible, then it makes it easier for the rest of the nation to believe it's possible. That is shifting a narrative within a community and then eventually across society. And so I could say more about some of the other things that you could look at, but to me, if you attach your narrative change work to policy, it makes it a little bit easier to measure.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out is really, really important, is measuring the conditions that need to change for that policy to take place or for that narrative to really get to an end state, is being like the hope gap is a great example of that. Laura, this one's for you. Okay. For impact investors seeking market rate or better returns and can get that now from energy projects, for example, how do creative economy investments compare?
So 10% of the U.S. economy is in the creative industries. The U.S. is the largest global exporter of creative services and the second largest global exporter after China of creative goods. So somehow we're very split in our awareness in the U.S., and we think arts and culture is always run by nonprofits and it always needs subsidy and it's always subscale and artists can't balance their checkbook, and we overlook the film and television industry, the music industry, the fashion industry, the beauty industry, all of these other big industries full of public companies and companies that private equity firms are happily investing in. And so just like elsewhere within impact investing, as an investor, you could find those catalytic capital opportunities where you're going to really amp up the impact and you're willing to sacrifice on the financial return. But you're absolutely going to find market rate return opportunities at the other end of the spectrum that can satisfy your impact goals as well.
Amazing. Ellen, this might be a good one for you to take on, but I leave it open to anybody on the panel. What's your favorite example of systems change built on narratives that I think here says built a durable positive impact?
A durable positive impact?
Yeah, like basically a narrative that has actually shifted some long-term policy or norm or that sort of thing.
Building on the reparations answer, which I do think is an important one, what I had been spending quite a bit of time on recently was thinking about the urgency and emergency around reproductive health care, reproductive rights. And I know that we're not in a successful moment now. We're in a crisis moment. But one of the things that I have been charting and thinking about and observing is the way the language around women's health care has changed. And it's become easier and easier for anybody in any body of any gender at any stage of life to begin to talk about this as not just an urgent question for the pregnant person and families and children, but also for communities as well. And I know there's been a lot of work from NARAL and Planned Parenthood and lots of other experts and providers who have been feeding in information and telling better stories and telling telling the wrenching and true stories of pain and loss and death and discomfort, but also of hope and opportunity. Very regular people are becoming more fluent in the difference between, where lack of abortion care is actually a racist issue, where it is disproportionately affecting women of color. It has become an economic issue, and the biggest piece of evidence I have for that is the number of both states who are rewarding companies with progressive healthcare policies and support policies with incentives to move to their states, which is brand new. This has been in the past, 10 months. The number has just grown to corporate CEOs who are saying the word abortion. I was talking to the CEO of Allstate the other day. I wouldn't just run into him in the street. I was asking him a series of questions, and he's just like he didn't even wait for me to ask. Here's where we are on the abortion thing. So a little white man from the Midwest is like, this is important to us. This is important to our families. This is like, and I've got a rubric of why are we like, and this is what we're going to say. This is really new. So I know that we're in a crisis point. I'm very worried about it, but the level of fluency I'm seeing around reproductive rights and just the healthcare of families is new and growing and encouraging.
Since we're in the catalytic philanthropy lane here, I think we should take a question that involves philanthropy. We're talking about systems change, which many times comes from multiple actors taking action and collaborating in some way. It can be hard, though, to justify both philanthropy and investing into the work done connecting those dots. How are you seeing these connections and collaborative action happening in your work?
Well, Upstart's a nonprofit, and we're run on grants. And I had to write this to a funder today, and something I actually take some pride in. Over the last 9 years, Upstart has mobilized $45 million to our mission. 80% of that has been impact investing capital that we have advised on, that we brought forward in partnership with LISC and Calvert through some pilot efforts that we put into the market to prove that if you built the vehicle, art-loving impact investors would show up and invest in it. And then we've recently raised $15 million for our inclusive creative economy strategy. So 20% of the money that we've raised has been grants that Upstart's used to pay the team and keep the lights on and do the work. And we've leveraged that for, with $10 million, we've leveraged $35 million effectively. So to me, and my team is like 4 or 5 people, right? So to me, that's how these two sources of capital can work together. Without the case making and the coalition building and creating these new vehicles and doing the work to mobilize the capital, the impact investors don't just go out and find these new themes and topics and priorities. But once you make this familiar and possible and demonstrate it, then the money will be able to move, and you won't need the grant funding to be supporting the ecosystem, because it will be built and it will be functioning. And so one of the things that we're starting to think about as we're imagining our future at Upstart, success for us is we go out of business because we're no longer necessary, because the ecosystem is built and it's working beautifully. And the wealth advisors can show their clients where to invest in the creative economy, and the fund managers are actively investing in businesses and creative industries, and all the museums are investing in a socially responsible way, right? But without the grant money to start to do that work, all the kind of work that you're hearing from my fellow panelists, you don't get the natural actions to occur on their own.
This one, I like this question, whoever wrote it, as a great go-around, so I'd love everybody to maybe take a minute each, which is a fair question to ask us. As you worked to shift the narratives, the three of you, that maintain broken systems, what self-narratives have you worked to transform within yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me,
Right answer.
yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think the overarchingly narratives around patriarchy are a big one that I'm grappling with, and then, another one is just, what does it mean to be in deep solidarity as a Black person with Indigenous people, particularly on the topic that I focus so much of my time and energy on, the topic of reparations. What does repair look like for people that look like me on land that was stolen and a genocide was committed? And something that's just always really been interesting to me, like over the past couple of years, there's been 2 Indigenous leaders who have said to me that I don't want to use the term reparations for the work that I do or for my community, because I don't want to co-opt that from the Black community, which is both like beautiful and sad at the same time. And in this new journey that I'm in with BLIS, with a co-founder that is Native, really thinking about that, just about that, how sad that is, that there's one community, there are 2 communities who have the biggest case to say that their communities deserve reparations because of the atrocities done onto them. But one community feels like they cannot because of the long call from the other community that has long been ignored. So sitting with that, and then also sitting with, what does it mean to be a man in undoing the harms of capitalism that were wrought onto this nation by not men that looked like me, but men. So also grappling with that, I think.
It's funny. I just confessed this to you as we were chatting before we came onto the panel. That, like, 2 quick things. One is like a really transformational memory for me. But the first one is the impulse to center myself as a harmed identity when I'm talking to other people. And was my example when we were talking was I was doing a lot of road tripping and traveling and reporting after September 11th, and I'm sitting at this mosque, we breaking fast, I'm talking to people I don't know, to Ann Arbor, Michigan, all these things are happening in this community, and like the words died in my throat. But it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I'm Black, I know about how bad the police are. It's like, this was not the moment for me to add myself to the conversation. This was my moment to really listen to the nuances of all of this. And so that I noticed that about myself, and I've been working on it. It was as I work on it. It's like, when are you in the conversation? When you're not in the conversation? And the other one, which is just this swagger of expertise and this veneer of I know what I'm doing, which has been so essential armor to navigate corporate spaces of any kind, but particularly corporate media. And Akira, I know you've heard this story before, and my face just burns in shame at the memory. I was doing reporting, I'm so ashamed. I was in Haiti, and I'd been doing a lot of self-funded work on extreme poverty, and I was studying water systems and engineering, and there was lots and lots and lots of trips. And so I was observing how communities were working in really poor rural parts of Haiti. I felt comfortable. I felt welcome. I sort of knew the vibe. We were on the back of a truck, and we were going from one village to another. People are really poor. There's a lot of downtime, so you're playing with kids, and you're talking to people, and sweeping and chopping. And as we were leaving, I put my hand to my mouth. It was just this joyous moment. I'm blowing kisses to these children who had just been rescued from a cholera epidemic, who had been going through like the most wrenching, like urgent hygiene training for washing their hands. It's like I just encouraged all these most vulnerable people I will ever know to put their hands to their mouth. And I'm sorry, I got emotional, but just I was so ashamed in that moment for my ignorance. And I thank God I noticed it, right? Because they're looking at me like, oh, why are these kids confused? It's like, because I might have killed them. So I talked to all the program people. I told what I had done. It's like, please make sure that I made a mistake and I didn't know what I was doing, and I've learned to wash my hands. I'm like, now I know what to do. And so I think I fixed it. But the thought that I was walking around with a sense of certainty and place, and I was doing something important, not realizing the inadvertent harm I might have done to people. I was so desperate to understand. So when I think I really know what I'm doing, and I think I'm really part of the story, and I think I'm really, which is hard for a writer, sometimes you really just have to commit to a narrative. You have to commit to the storyline. I remember that, and I remember their faces and think, I don't know what I am talking about, and that has served me so well. Thank you for your kindness.
Oh, thank you so much, Ellen, for being so vulnerable with us. And I know that every time you tell the story, it unearths as if the entire experience all over again. So it's so generous of you to share that with you. And there's a lot in both. I don't want to take, Laura, your time, so I want you to be able to share too. But there's, I think, very relatable to a lot of us here, both of what you guys have shared very vulnerably. So Laura, if you don't mind taking us home.
So as a founder and a fund manager who's a woman, I've had people, usually women, but not always, encourage me that I need to take more credit for what we've accomplished. And as someone who's really proud to have worked most of her career in the social sector, the team does it, it's all together, or you don't boast, or you recognize all the limitations and shortcomings of where you are against your goals and the mission you're trying to accomplish. So it's been interesting to have, and I don't think I'm a particularly shy or modest person, frankly, but to have trusted colleagues and advisors encourage me that in service of the work I'm doing, I actually need to be a little bit bolder about claiming success and credit. And I've also had people say, when I'm like, we're not ready, we need more evidence, we have to demonstrate, we have to prove our ability to do this before we go out, we're not ready to go to the market yet, that male fund managers don't feel that same burden or obligation, and they go out and they, tell their story, and they raise their capital, and they do their work, and they fail, and they succeed, but they don't feel that same burden of needing to be so well proven before they're even able to start the process.